The summit smelled like recycled air and old compromise. Neutral Station Orange 7 had been hosting diplomatic meetings for 60 years, and somewhere in those 60 years, the ventilation system had absorbed the collective anxiety of 1,000 failed negotiations and decided to hold on to it. The walls were pale. The chairs were ergonomically designed for 17 different body types and comfortable for none of them. The lighting was the particular shade of white that made everyone look slightly unwell. Ambassador Thessaly Chen had been standing at the center of the main hall for 45 minutes, and she had been smiling for all 45 of them. It was a good smile, a practiced smile, the kind that took years to build, not because smiling was hard, but because this kind of smiling was a skill, a discipline, almost a martial art. It never touched her eyes unless she wanted it to. It never broke unless she chose to let it. It said, "We are reasonable, we are patient, we are grateful for your presence here today," and it said all of that without a single word, which was efficient, because Thessaly had learned early that words were just more things that could be apologized for later. She was apologizing right now, actually. "The Vorathi Collective's comfort is our absolute priority," she said, in Standard Galactic, and then in Vorathi Third Dialect, and then because Delegate Kethra's personal assistant had communicated that Third Dialect carried aggressive tonal undertones when used by non-Vorathi speakers, in a simplified phonetic approximation that the translation chip in her ear was doing its best with. "The incident was entirely our fault. We are grateful for your patience." The incident had been eye contact. One of the junior human staffers, a kid named Petrov who was 22 and had been on his first diplomatic rotation for exactly 9 days, had looked directly at Kethra while handing him a water glass. Vorathi delegates considered direct eye contact from a lesser species to be a form of territorial challenge. Petrov had not known this. He had been trying to be polite. Now Thessaly was apologizing in 3 languages for Petrov's politeness, and Petrov was standing against the far wall looking like he wanted to evaporate. Kethra accepted the apology without acknowledging it. He was a tall creature, most Vorathi were, with a face that moved the way stone moved, slowly, under geological pressure, and never more than it had to. His delegation sat behind him in a perfect row, all of them wearing the particular expression of species who are very comfortable and would like to stay that way. Commander Yale Oren stood at the perimeter of the room. She was not part of the diplomatic team. She was station security, present because protocol required a human military officer at any summit of this grade, and absent enough to not cause offense. She stood at the wall with her hands behind her back and she watched. She watched Thessaly apologize. She watched Petrov disappear into himself. She watched Kethra's personal assistant make a small note on his datapad, probably logging the infraction, probably attaching it to some file somewhere that would become a reason for something later. And she watched the delegate from the Murath sovereignty lean over to his colleague and say something that made them both produce the Murath equivalent of a laugh. The Murath equivalent of a laugh sounded like gravel in a dryer. Yale had been in enough rooms like this one to know what the laugh meant. It meant, look at them, look how easy they are to manage. She didn't move. She didn't change her expression. She had a face built for exactly this, strong lines, difficult to read, the kind of face that gave nothing away because there was nothing to give, or at least that was what it looked like from the outside. On the inside, she was doing the math. She had been doing the math for a long time. The goodwill gesture had been Thessaly's idea. It sat on a display stand near the entrance to the hall, a piece of sculpture from New Kyoto, one of the original Earth colony settlements on the second ring. White ceramic, abstract. It had been made by a woman named Hanasu who had died 12 years ago and whose work had sold for more than most colony budgets at the last major Earth arts auction. It was not priceless, but it was careful. It was the kind of careful that took a lifetime. Thessaly had arranged for it to be shipped here, as a symbol of cultural exchange. The Vorathi Jr. attaché, young, maybe 40 by their age reckoning, which made him approximately Petrov's equivalent, walked past the display stand near the end of the first session, and his sleeve caught the edge of the plinth, and Hana Sao's careful lifetime hit the floor in 4 pieces. The sound it made was very small, the kind of small that fills a room. Kethra looked at the pieces on the floor, then he looked at his attaché, then he looked at Thessaly. He did not say sorry. The Vorathi language had a word for it. Yale knew, she had checked, but he did not use it. His attaché said something in Vorathi that the translation chip rendered as fragile materials, poor placement. Thessaly was already moving. Not at all, she said. The placement was ours. We should have been more careful. She was smiling. The smile was perfect, not a line out of place. We'll have it repaired. Please don't give it another thought. Kethra did not give it another thought. Yale looked at the 4 pieces on the floor. The ceramic was still white. Clean break lines, the kind that meant it had been solid and whole right up until the moment it wasn't. She looked at Thessaly's smile. How long have we been doing this? Not a question. A number she was trying to calculate, and finding that the number kept getting bigger the further back she looked. After the first session, there was a meal period. The Vorathi delegation ate privately, which was customary and also a relief, because the Vorathi digestion process involved sounds that required the humans to find somewhere else to be. Yale found the observation deck, where the stars were doing what stars always did, existing without any particular interest in what was happening below them. And she stood there with a cup of bad coffee and thought about patience. 200 years of it. She had studied the history the way all human military officers were required to. The first contact, the negotiations, the slow expansion of the Galactic Accord and humanity's careful, deliberate positioning within it. They had been the newcomers back then, small, unproven. It made sense to be careful. It made sense to be patient and collaborative and to learn the customs and to apologize when the customs were misread. 200 years ago, the patience had been a strategy. Somewhere along the way it had become a habit. Somewhere after that it had become expected. She drank the coffee. It tasted like the ventilation system smelled. Petrov appeared next to her, looking out at the same stars. He had changed his jacket. The first one had water on it from the glass he'd been holding when the eye contact incident happened, because he had flinched when Kethra's assistant spoke. Am I going to get reassigned? He asked. No, Yale said. I didn't know about the eye contact thing. I know. I was just trying to be. I know, she said again, not unkindly. Petrov was quiet for a moment. Then, does it get easier? The apologizing for things that aren't your fault. Yale looked at the stars. She thought about her mother. Retired now, living on the second ring, 81 years old and still carrying the particular forward lean of someone who spent decades ready to bow. She thought about a recording she had seen once, her mother at a summit not unlike this one, 20 years ago, apologizing in 3 languages for a different broken thing in front of a different alien delegation wearing the same comfortable expression. Same smile, same slight tilt of the head. Different room, same story. It doesn't get easier, she said. You just get better at doing it. She set the coffee down. Get some sleep, she told Petrov. Second session starts at 0600. Kethra filed his mission report that night from his private quarters, aboard the Vorathi diplomatic shuttle docked at the station's outer ring. He wrote it efficiently, the way he wrote everything. The summit was proceeding according to expectation. The human delegation was cooperative and appropriately deferential. No security concerns of any significance, one minor cultural protocol violation, quickly corrected. He recommended expanded resource extraction terms for the Halcyon corridor trading lanes. He recommended an increased transit allowance for Vorathi commercial convoys through the second ring. He recommended that the current diplomatic approach be maintained, as it was producing favorable results. At the bottom of the report, in the field-marked threat assessment, he wrote, "Low. Species remains non-confrontational and manageable. No revision of current posture required." He submitted it and went to sleep. In the hall of Neutral Station Orin 7, the 4 pieces of Hana Sao's sculpture sat on the floor where they had fallen because no one had thought to move them yet. The night maintenance drone, running its scheduled route, stopped in front of them, processed the obstacle, cataloged them as debris, moved on. The Halcyon corridor was not a beautiful stretch of space. It had none of the visual drama of the nebula clusters near the outer rim, none of the soft blue light of the Marin gas fields, none of the things that made people stop and think about how large everything was. It was just a lane, a functional path between 2 populated systems, mapped and registered and used, because it was the most efficient route between point A and point B, and efficiency was the language the galaxy ran on. Marin Colony Station sat at the corridor's midpoint like a period at the end of a sentence nobody had finished writing. 14,000 people lived there, families mostly, workers in the atmospheric processing plants that fed 3 downstream colonies their breathable air, teachers, doctors, children who had never been to Earth and called this their home because it was. The station's hull was thick and functional and covered in the kind of small dents and repair patches that came from 23 years of existing in a place where the weather was made of radiation and debris. It was not glamorous. It was also not shielded. Not against wake turbulence, not against the particular kind of pressure wave that a heavy-class Vorathi cargo convoy produced when it pushed through a narrow lane at standard transit speed. The physics of it were not complicated. The corridor was tight. The convoys were large. The pressure differential created by their engines rolled outward like water from a stone dropped in a pond, and what it rolled toward, at the corridor's midpoint, was 14,000 people inside a hull that had not been built with that specific variable in mind. The Vorathi knew this. They had known it for 11 years. There was a report, a Galactic Accord safety assessment, filed, stamped, forwarded to the relevant parties, acknowledged with the standard response code that meant we have received your communication, and which had no follow-up action attached to it. The convoys had come through 40 times since that report. Humanity had filed 40 formal complaints. The complaints were in a file. The file was in a database. The database had a very organized folder structure. Yale was in the command bay when the convoy appeared on the scope. She had been there since 0400, which was 2 hours before her shift started, because she had learned a long time ago that the things worth worrying about rarely announced themselves during business hours. The command bay was small and slightly too warm and smelled like old coffee. She had contributed to that smell, and from her station, she could see the full sweep of the corridor on the monitor bank. She saw the convoy signature appear at the corridor entrance. She pulled up the registration, Vorathi Commercial Fleet, 7 heavy-class cargo transports, no advance clearance filed, no hail sent. Standard practice. She sat with that for a moment. Her comms officer, a young woman named Di-Young who had the particular alertness of someone who had been told too many times that nothing ever happened out here, looked over from her station. Vorathi convoy commander, coming in on the standard lane. "I see it," Yale said. "Do you want me to send the formal complaint now or after?" There was no sarcasm in the question. That was the worst part. The process had become so routine that Di-Young was asking it the way someone asks whether you want cream in your coffee, just a preference, just logistics, the outcome already known before the question finished. Yale pulled up the Marin evacuation protocols on the secondary screen. She did not start them. She just had them open. The way you keep an umbrella near the door not because you expect rain, but because you have been rained on before and you remember what wet feels like. After, Yale said. She watched the convoy on the scope. They pushed through at standard transit speed. 7 heavy-class transports, engines running full, the pressure wave rolling outward exactly as the physics said it would. On her seismic monitor, the station registered it, a tremor, low grade, the kind that made cups rattle on desks and made children ask their parents what that was. Nothing failed. Nothing cracked. 14,000 people breathed out without knowing they had breathed in. Yale closed the evacuation protocols. She sent the formal complaint. She had written it so many times she could have done it unconscious. The Marin Colony Station respectfully submits this formal objection to the unauthorized transit of Vorathi commercial vessels through the Halcyon Corridor in violation of Galactic Accord Statute 7 Bravo, Section 4, Paragraph 2. It went on for 3 paragraphs. She had a template. She changed the date and the convoy registry number and hit send, and the complaint went into the file, and the file went into the database, and the database's folder structure remained very organized. She sat back in her chair. Outside the viewport, the corridor was empty again, clean, quiet. The stars were doing what they always did. She had been thinking about the Vorathi threat file for 3 weeks. Not because anyone had asked her to, not as part of any assignment. Just the way you come back to something that sits wrong, that has a smell to it you can't name but can't stop noticing. The file was publicly available. Any officer with Accord clearance could read it. Most didn't bother because it was old and because it said what everyone already knew. Humanity was assessed as non-aggressive, conflict-averse, cooperative, and of low military concern to neighboring species. It was not wrong exactly. It was just reading the menu and thinking it understood the kitchen. What the file didn't mention, that humanity's military doctrine had been described as reactive and historically under-resourced because humanity had made a choice 2 centuries ago to put its resources into other things: medicine, terraforming, agricultural engineering that could feed a colony of 10,000 on 6 acres of rock. They had built hospitals instead of warships, and they had done it on purpose. The way you put your money in savings instead of spending it, because you are thinking about later. Later was a concept the Vorathi file did not appear to have considered. What the file also didn't mention, that reactive was not the same as slow. A reaction could be slower than an action. That was true. Most of the time it was. But it could also be something that had been quietly, methodically prepared for, so that when the moment came, the reaction was already loaded, already aimed, already waiting for the signal to stop being potential energy and start being the other kind. Yale pulled up her own files, classified, her own notes kept in a private log she had been adding to for 4 years, ever since she took the posting at Marin. She read through them. 40 unauthorized transits, 11 years of known hazard data ignored, formal complaints processed at an average of 6 days and filed without response, 3 safety summit requests from Marin denied on scheduling grounds, 2 escalations to the Accord level, both tabled. She added the morning's entry. Then she opened an encrypted channel she had not opened in 2 months. "Flag it," she said. Her comms officer looked over. "Flag what, Commander?" "Everything," Yale said. "Every complaint, every transit, every date and time and convoy registration and seismic reading. Pull it all, clean copy. I want it ready." De-Jong stared at her for a second. "Ready for what?" Yale looked at the corridor on the scope. Empty, quiet, the stars not caring. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I want it ready." That night, a message came from her mother. Her mother, Sujin, was 81 years old and lived on the 2nd ring in a house with a garden she had no idea how to maintain, but kept trying to because it gave her something to do with her hands. She had retired 8 years ago after 31 years in the diplomatic corps. She had been good at it. Very good. She had the particular talent for it that came from genuinely caring about getting along with other species, while also being very, very tired, which was a combination that produced excellent diplomats and people who slept badly. The message was a recording, an old one. She had been digitizing archives from her career, organizing things. The way old people did when the past started to feel more manageable than the present. She had forwarded it without comment. It was footage from a summit, 20 years ago. A different station, a different delegation, but recognizable immediately for what it was: the same light, the same pale walls, the same table design that the Accord used everywhere because they had standardized the furniture in 2187 and never revisited the decision. In the footage, a younger Sujin stood at the center of the room. She was apologizing. The details were different. A different cultural misread, a different species, a different broken thing. Yale couldn't tell what exactly, the recording angle didn't show it, but the shape of it was identical. The slight tilt of the head, the careful, open hands, the three-language apology delivered without hesitation, without stumbling, without any evidence of the cost. Same smile. Yale watched it for 2 minutes, then she closed it. She sat in the dark of her quarters for a while. She thought about Petrov asking if it got easier. She thought about 40 complaints in a database with good folder structure. She thought about the seismic reading from that morning and 14,000 people who hadn't felt it land. She thought about the word later. She opened her duty log and made one entry. Not about the convoy, not about the complaints. Just, patience is not the same as permission. She closed the log. Outside, the corridor was dark and quiet, and exactly as wide as it had always been. For now, the alert came at 03:17. Not a convoy this time. De Jong's voice on the comm was steady. She had gotten steadier over the past 3 weeks, as if the preparation work, the flagging and the compiling and the clean copies of every date and every transit had given her something solid to stand on. Commander, 6 signatures on the corridor entry, Vorathi registry, military class. Yale was out of her bunk before De Jong finished the sentence. Military class was different from commercial class in 3 important ways. First, the mass tonnage was higher, which made the wake turbulence problem significantly worse. Second, military transits had an entirely separate set of Accord protocols. They required advance notice, formal clearance requests, a stated purpose, and a response from the station authority before entering. Third, and most simply, nobody brought warships to a cargo corridor. Nobody did that by accident. She was in the command bay in 4 minutes, pulling on her jacket with one hand and reading the scope data with the other. 6 ships, military class, moving in formation, tight and deliberate, the kind of formation that had a message in it: we are organized, we are coordinated, we are here on purpose. No advance notice had been filed. No clearance request had been sent. No stated purpose. Just 6 ships coming down the corridor the way a hand comes down on a table, not to destroy anything, just to make a sound. Kethra was on the lead ship. Yale didn't know that yet. She would learn it later, in the testimony and the reports and the Accord investigation that would go on for months. But in that moment she just had 6 signatures on a scope and a station of 14,000 people at the corridor's midpoint, and a knowledge, settled and clear in her chest, of exactly what this was. It was a show. A dominance display, something the Vorathi had done at 5 other species borders in the past decade, a military transit unauthorized into claimed space, designed to demonstrate that the space was not as claimed as the claiming species thought. It almost never led to actual conflict. It didn't need to. The other species always hailed, always protested, always issued the formal complaint and then stood down, and the Vorathi logged it and moved on, and the precedent was set. Your borders are suggestions. On 5 other borders, it had worked perfectly. This was the 6th. Kethra stood on the bridge of the Resolve, flagship of the diplomatic escort fleet, a title that meant something very specific in Vorathi political language, enough firepower to make a point without starting a war. He was comfortable. That was the honest word for what he was. He had done this before. He knew the shape of it. The human station would detect them. The human station would hail them. A polite, formal communication would arrive, citing the relevant Accord statutes, expressing concern, requesting them to stand down. He would not respond immediately. He would let them send it twice, maybe 3 times, so that the record showed patience on the Vorathi side and urgency on the human side. That framing was useful later. Then he would respond with a technical citation of his own. The Halcyon Corridor's registered transit lanes included military access provisions under a 2219 addendum that was technically valid, although practically never invoked. He had used it before. The humans would recognize the addendum. They would counter that the addendum required advance notice. He would apologize for the oversight. By then the formation would be halfway through the corridor, the point would be made, and the subsequent diplomatic exchange would establish that Vorathi military presence in the lane was, if not approved, at least not impossible. Small moves, patient moves, the way you reshape a boundary not by breaking it but by leaning on it until it moves. He waited for the hail. It came at 0331. Not panicked, not rushed. The signal was clean and direct, and the voice that came through the comm channel was level in the way that, if Kethra had been paying a different kind of attention, would have told him something important. Vorathi military formation, this is Commander Yale Oren, Marin Station Defense. You are in an unauthorized transit of a protected corridor without clearance, advance notice, or stated purpose. This is a violation of Galactic Accord Statute 7 Bravo, Section 4, and Accord Military Transit Protocol 12 Alpha in full. Kethra listened. He recognized the statutes. He had expected them. He did not respond yet. You have 5 seconds to reverse course before I interpret your presence as an act of war. He blinked. That was slightly different from the script. The other 5 borders had not included a timeline. He recalibrated quickly. She was raising the stakes, still within the pattern, just more aggressive in framing. It was a negotiating posture. She would not actually. I will not repeat this. His communications officer looked at him, waiting. Kethra held up one hand. Wait. He had done this before. The silence was part of it. You let them speak. You did not respond. You let the silence stretch until they sent the second message, more urgent, and then you responded to the second message, not the first, because responding to the first gave it weight it did not deserve. He watched the scope. The formation moved forward. 3 seconds. 4. Yale did not watch the clock. She did not need to. The seconds were not in the clock, they were in her chest, precise and separate, one at a time, like a hand counting them off. She had not slept well in 4 years. She had been doing math in her head for 4 years. 40 transits, 11 years of ignored safety data, 1 sculpture on a floor in 4 pieces, a recording of her mother apologizing for a broken thing in 3 languages, Petrov asking if it got easier, 40 complaints in a database with excellent folder structure. She thought about later. She thought about patience not being the same as permission. The 5th second landed. No response from the formation. It kept moving. She looked at De-Jong. De-Jong looked back at her. Well, Yale said. 1 breath. All right then. She hit the weapon's activation sequence. What came online was not what the Vorathi threat file had predicted. The file had assessed Marin Station Defense as a light-capacity perimeter installation with limited offensive capability. That was accurate for what the file had been able to see: the registered, declared hardware, the systems that appeared on standard surveys, the official loadout that any Accord inspection would have documented. The file had not considered what happened when a species that had been under-resourced by choice decided that later had arrived. 4 years Yale had been at Marin. 4 years of requisitions and upgrades and careful, quiet additions to the station's capability profile, logged under maintenance budgets and infrastructure development, and a dozen other categories that said nothing specific about what was actually being built. Not because she had been planning this moment specifically, not because she was certain it would ever come, but because reactive was not the same as slow, and she had been a soldier long enough to know that when you decided to carry an umbrella, you kept it near the door. 2 of the 6 ships were disabled before Kethra finished the order to his weapons officer. Not destroyed. Disabled, engines down, navigation locked, sitting in the corridor like large and embarrassing furniture. The targeting had been surgical, deliberate, aimed specifically at drive systems and leaving everything else intact, because Yale was not trying to start a war. She was drawing a line. The remaining 4 ships reversed course. Not slowly, not after further communication. They reversed in the particular hurried way of something that has just recalculated very quickly and does not like the new numbers. The corridor was quiet. On the scope, the 2 disabled ships sat still. Around them, nothing moved. De Young's hands were flat on her console. Her voice, when she spoke, was very careful. "Commander, do you want me to? What do you should I?" "Send them a tow offer," Yale said. "Standard courtesy. We'll help them move the ships to the nearest Vorathi-accessible dock." De Young stared at her. "We're offering to help them." "They're disabled in a lane I need clear," Yale said. "It's practical." She sat back in her chair. Outside, the corridor was quiet and empty, except for 2 large ships that had just learned something about the difference between patience and permission. She felt in her chest the thing she could not name exactly, not satisfaction, not triumph, nothing as clean as either of those. Something older, something that had been waiting a long time to stop being held. She picked up her cold coffee. It still tasted terrible. She drank it anyway. On the bridge of the Resolve, Kethra stood very still. The 2 ships on his scope were not moving. The corridor behind him was filling with the retreat signatures of his own formation. The tow offer from the human station sat in his communications queue, polite and practical, and somehow the most unsettling thing that had happened in the last 6 minutes. He thought about the threat file. Low, species remains non-confrontational and manageable. He thought about the weapons that had come online, the targeting precision, the deliberate restraint in the damage profile, drives only, nothing else, which was not the work of something frightened or angry. It was the work of something that knew exactly what it was doing and had chosen carefully how much to do. He had been at 5 other borders. None of them had felt like this. He stood on the bridge of the Resolve, and he did the thing he had not needed to do in a very long time at a human border. He recalculated. The footage was 11 minutes and 40 seconds long. It covered the entire incident. From the moment the 6 Vorathi ships appeared on the corridor scope to the moment the tow offer was transmitted. Someone on Marin Station had been running a routine external recording for maintenance documentation purposes. The footage was raw and unedited and showed everything: the approach, the hail, the silence, the 5 seconds, and then the 2 disabled ships sitting in the corridor like a question that had just been answered in a language nobody expected. By the time Yale sat down for her morning debrief, the footage had been seen by every sitting delegate at the Galactic Accord main chamber. By the time she finished the debrief, it had been seen by their staff. By the time she ate lunch, field rations, at her desk, because the command bay still needed to be staffed, it had been seen by most of the populated galaxy. It was not the footage itself that made things move so fast. It was the silence in it. The 5 seconds of Kethra not responding, and then the 4 ships revering, and then the tow offer, courteous and practical, and somehow the most civilized part of an event that had just rewritten every risk assessment in a dozen intelligence files. People watched it and they felt, without being able to fully explain why, that something had changed. Something that had been one way for a very long time had stopped being that way. The Accord emergency session was called within 18 hours. The chamber at Accord Central was large and designed to hold the representatives of 47 species simultaneously, which meant the acoustics were a catastrophe, and everyone needed a translation chip just to navigate the echo. It had been built during a period of optimism about cooperative governance, and it smelled faintly of that optimism now, slightly stale, like bread from the day before. Thessaly Chen was the human delegate. She arrived 11 minutes early, which was her custom. She arranged her materials. She reviewed her notes. She had been given a briefing package on the incident, dry, factual, thorough, and she had read it 3 times on the transit. She had also watched the footage 4 times. She sat at the human delegation table, and she waited. The other delegates arrived. They arranged themselves the way delegates always did, the large species near the back where their height was less of an issue, the smaller species toward the front. The Murath delegation clustered together as they always did, and the Vorathi delegation, led by a deputy attaché, because Kethra was still on the resolve at the corridor edge waiting for the tow. The deputy attaché's name was Levsera. She was young for a senior delegate, which in Vorathi years meant she was approximately 90. She had not been at the summit on Orin 7. She had not watched her superior file a threat assessment of low while standing in a room with a woman who was quietly counting to 40. She arranged her materials. She looked across the chamber at Thessaly Chen. Thessaly looked back at her. Neither of them smiled yet. The session opened with the Vorathi formal complaint, which was presented by Levsera in a voice that was carefully controlled and somewhat undermined by the fact that everyone in the room had seen the footage. The complaint was unprovoked aggression, disproportionate military response to a routine transit, violation of Accord peacekeeping principles. The human station commander had acted unilaterally, without authorization, and had disabled 2 vessels of a member species without cause. The word she used was barbaric. She used it twice. The chamber was quiet in the particular way of a room full of species who were each privately doing their own version of Kethra's recalculation, and did not want to show it on their faces. One of the Murath delegates leaned toward his colleague and said something. They did not produce the gravel-dryer laugh this time. They did not produce any sound at all. The chair of the session, a Gethlin mediator named Oru, who had been running Accord sessions for 30 years and had the practiced patience of someone who had once sat through a 7-hour procedural dispute about parking allocation near Docking Bay 14, asked the human delegation to respond. Thessaly stood up. She did not open her materials. She looked at Levsera for a moment. Then she looked around the chamber slowly, not dramatically, just taking it in, the way you look at a room you've been in 100 times and are seeing clearly for the first time. She said, Commander Orin acted under Galactic Accord Statute 7 Bravo, Section 4, and Military Transit Protocol 12 Alpha. The Vorathi formation was in unauthorized transit of a protected corridor without clearance, without advance notice, and without stated purpose. This is not a novel situation. It is the 41st instance of this specific violation at Marin Station alone in 11 years. She paused. I have the documentation for all 41. She set a data chip on the table. She did not move it toward anyone. She just placed it there, in front of her, quietly, the way you put down something heavy you have been carrying for a long time. The chamber processed this. Levsera said, The 40 previous incidents were resolved through diplomatic channels. They were filed, Thessaly said. That is not the same thing. The room went quiet again. The Murath delegates were no longer looking at each other. They were looking at the chip on the table. The session ran for 9 hours. During the break, the intelligence analysts who worked for 11 different Accord member species were, simultaneously and separately, requesting access to previously classified human military assessments. Some of these requests were denied on jurisdictional grounds. Some were approved. Some were simply pulled, retrieved, read quickly in small offices by people who had not thought to look before because the file had said low and the file had seemed reliable. What they found was not aggression. That was the part that kept coming up in the reports that would be written about this period later. The surprise was not that humanity had a military capacity that had been underestimated. Militaries could be hidden, could be developed quietly, could be built behind budget lines that said infrastructure. That was not unusual. That happened. What was unusual was what it looked like. It was not built for conquest. The ship designs were defensive. The weapon systems were targeted and precise and structured around the concept of enough rather than maximum. The deployment history was a list of moments where humanity could have pressed an advantage and had not. The strategy documents read like the work of a species that had thought very carefully about what it wanted and decided that what it wanted mostly was to be left alone to do the things it was actually interested in doing. Medicine, terraforming, agriculture on 6 acres of rock. They had not been building an empire. They had been building a door lock. And they had been patient about it because they were genuinely patient people. They had not been suppressing an aggressive nature. They had just been tired and polite. And finally, at 03:30 on a Tuesday morning over a corridor that 14,000 people breathed through, not polite anymore. That was the part the analysts kept sitting with. You could prepare for aggression. You could prepare for conquest. You could run the models and build the defenses and move the pieces. You could not really prepare for patience running out. Oru called the final portion of the session to order at hour 8. The question on the table was, did Commander Oren's actions constitute a violation of Accord peacekeeping principles? The vote was taken. Yale was not present for it. She was at Marin on duty because the corridor still needed to be staffed and field rations were still mediocre, and the stars were still not interested in any of this. The result was not unanimous, but it was clear. No violation found. Lev Serra received the result without expression, which was itself an expression. A contained one, the kind that happened when the math came out the way you expected but had hoped it wouldn't. One delegate from the Auric sovereignty, small species quiet, had not spoken once in 9 hours, raised a procedural question after the vote. Going forward, the Auric delegate said, what is the current human threat assessment? Oru looked at his materials. The current filed assessment from the relevant intelligence sources is. No, the Auric delegate said, the updated one from this morning. Someone on the chamber floor pulled it up. An analyst, young, slightly overwhelmed, doing the job of reading it aloud in a room full of 47 species who were all, in their own ways, very quietly paying attention. He read the new rating. The room was quiet in a way that rooms do not usually go quiet. Not frightened exactly. More like recalibrated. Thessaly walked back to her shuttle alone. The corridor of Accord Central was long and the lighting was the same pale white as every other Accord facility, and her footsteps made the same sound they always made. She passed a cleaning unit running its scheduled route. She passed 2 junior staffers from the Murath delegation who moved aside for her, not dramatically, just moved. She had not noticed that happening before. She thought about that as she walked. She thought about the chip on the table and the 41 complaints in the database, and the footage from a surveillance system that had been running for maintenance purposes and had, entirely by accident, recorded the moment something changed. She thought about Yale's voice in the footage. Level, no fear in it. Just a woman who had done her math and reached the end of a very long calculation and found the answer clear. She thought about the sculpture on the floor of Neutral Station Orange 7. In 4 pieces. Nobody had said sorry. She reached her shuttle, sat down, let the door close. In the quiet of the cabin, with no delegates to face and no smile required, she put her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She did not smile. For the first time in a very long time in a professional context, she simply sat there with her face doing nothing in particular, which was, in its own small way, an enormous relief. Kethra resigned his ambassadorship 4 days later. He did not announce it. He did not hold a press statement or file a formal explanation. He submitted the paperwork through the standard administrative channel, and then he stopped showing up. And when his assistant asked what should be done about the pending summit invitations, he said, "Cancel them," and went to his study and sat there for a long time. He had been at 5 other borders. He sat in his study, and he thought about all 5 of them. He thought about the hail and the silence in the 5 seconds. He thought about the tow offer. He thought about what it meant, offering a tow. What kind of calculation produced that? What kind of species sent a courteous, practical, no hard feelings tow offer to a military formation it had just disabled in its own corridor? A species that was not angry, he decided. A species that had simply stopped. That distinction kept him in his chair for a very long time. He did not file any further threat assessments. He did not have a number for what he had seen. Low did not cover it. Neither did high. It was something else, something that did not fit the scale, because the scale had been built without accounting for the variable of a patient species that had finally, carefully, and without any particular drama, decided it was done being patient. He sat in his study. Outside, the stars were doing what they always did. Not one of them cared at all. 3 months was enough time for some things to settle and not enough time for others. The renegotiated terms took 6 weeks. Humanity's diplomatic team, Thessaly at the front, 24 support staff behind her, 41 complaints worth of documentation stacked on the table like a quiet argument that had been waiting years to be made, sat across from 12 Accord delegates and a Vorathi secondary team and worked through it line by line. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. It involved a great deal of very precise language and the kind of careful reading of previous agreements that made the junior staffer's eyes go flat by hour 3. But it was different this time, in a way that was hard to name but easy to feel. Before, the negotiations had been a thing that happened to humanity, a process they participated in by agreeing to terms that had mostly been pre-shaped by the species who assumed they would agree. Now it was a conversation, an actual one, with pauses in it where the other side stopped to consider what was being said, which was a small thing and also not small at all. The Halcyon Corridor, closed to unauthorized military transit, effective immediately, with a new clearance protocol that required advance notice and a stated purpose, and an actual response from the station authority before anyone went anywhere. Not a suggestion, a provision signed, with an enforcement mechanism attached. 41 complaints resolved. No ceremony, just signatures. Thessaly had the paperwork framed. Not on her office wall. That would have been the wrong kind of proud. She put it in a drawer in her desk, where she could take it out and look at it when things felt heavy, which was often, because things were still complicated and the galaxy was still the galaxy and the work was not done. But the drawer existed now. That was new. New Kyoto commissioned the sculpture 6 weeks after the summit. The artist was a young man named T1 Park, 26 years old, who had never sold a major piece before, and who had applied for the commission on something between confidence and absolute terror. He had studied Hana Sao's work extensively. He knew the four pieces on the floor of Oran 7 by photograph, had held the image of them in his mind for weeks while he worked. He did not try to replace what had been broken. What he made was different, larger, the same white ceramic but with hard angles where Hana Sao's had been curved, and it took up the space it occupied in a way that did not apologize for its presence. It was not aggressive, there was nothing violent in it, but it was solid in a way that said, "This is here, and it intends to remain here, and it was made by people who have decided to stop pretending otherwise." The unveiling was on a Tuesday morning. Thessaly attended. She stood at the back of the small crowd gathered in the new Kyoto Cultural Center, colony families, local officials, a few journalists who had flown in, because the story of the sculpture had carried its own news weight in the months since Oran 7. The room smelled like the atmospheric processors that kept the colony alive, that particular mix of filtered air and warm electronics that anyone who had grown up in a second-ring settlement knew in their bones. The sculpture was uncovered. People were quiet for a moment. Then someone began to clap, and the rest followed, and T1 Park stood next to his work looking terrified and grateful in equal measure. And Thessaly looked at the clean, hard angles of it and thought about Hana Sao's four pieces, and about what it meant that this was not a replacement. It meant something had changed. It meant you did not always have to go back to what had been broken and try to make it whole again. Sometimes you made a new thing, and the new thing did not have the history of the broken thing in it. It had something else, something that came after, which was its own kind. She left before the reception. She had a shuttle to catch. Yale heard about the sculpture from De-Jong, who had seen the news feed. "It's good," De-Jong said, showing her the image on a datapad during the morning briefing. "Different from the old one. Harder, kind of." Yale looked at it, the clean angles, the unapologetic use of space. "Yeah," she said, "good." She handed the pad back and returned to the scope feed, where the halcyon corridor was doing what it had been doing for 3 months now, being quiet, being empty, being a lane that belonged to someone, clearly and officially and with an enforcement mechanism, which made it different from the lane it had been before even though it looked exactly the same on a monitor. The morning's first transit request came in at 0800. Vorathi Registry, Commercial Class. The clearance request was complete, advance notice filed 2 days earlier, stated purpose listed as standard cargo delivery to the outer settlements, a contact name and a response acknowledgement code. Everything in order. De-Jong looked at her. Yale reviewed the request, checked the documentation, looked at the formation on the scope, one freighter lone vessel, running the lane the same way it had run it 41 times before, except this time it had asked. This time it had waited for an answer. She granted clearance. "Confirm receipt to the transit captain," she said. "Standard courtesy." De-Jong sent it. On the scope, the freighter moved through the corridor at appropriate speed, the wake turbulence profile well within safe limits for an unshielded habitat, and reached the corridor's midpoint, right beside Marin Station, and kept going, steady and unremarkable, the most ordinary transit of cargo from one point to another. Yale watched it pass. She thought about the 41 times before this. All the times the lane had been used as if her station wasn't there, as if 14,000 people were a fact of geography rather than a fact of life. Just a coordinate, just a thing the corridor happened to pass, not worth adjusting speed for, not worth the notice. She thought about how different it felt, this transit, not because anything visible had changed. The lane looked the same. The freighter looked the same. The stars were still not interested. But the freighter had asked. That was the whole of it, really. It had asked. The message from her mother came that evening. Not a recording this time. Just text, which was how her mother communicated when she had thought about what she wanted to say for long enough to trust herself to be brief. It read, "I watched the hearing, you didn't smile." A space after that, which on a screen looked like nothing but which Yale read as everything. The pause of a woman who had spent 31 years smiling in rooms where the smile was a tool and a tax simultaneously, who understood exactly what it cost, who had paid it and knew the shape of the debt. Then, "Good girl." Yale read it twice. She sat with it for a moment in the quiet of the command bay, the scope feeds running in the periphery, the corridor empty and clear outside the viewport. She thought about her mother at 81 with her garden she couldn't maintain and her archive of recordings and her forward lean that 31 years of diplomatic work had built into her spine like a structural element. She thought about what it meant to be told "good girl" by someone who had done the other thing for 3 decades, not as criticism, not as regret, as something else, as a woman setting something down, as someone who had carried a thing for a long time and was, through 2 words to her daughter, choosing to not carry it anymore. She closed the message. She opened her duty log. She wrote 2 words. Day 1. Not because everything was fixed. Not because the galaxy had become a fair place overnight, or because 200 years of careful smallness could be undone by a 5-second incident in a cargo corridor. Not because the work was finished, or the math was complete, or the next thing wouldn't require its own patience, and its own preparation, and its own long, quiet accounting. But because something had started. Because the drawer with the paperwork existed now. Because the freighter had asked. Because the sculpture in New Kyoto did not apologize for the space it took up, and neither would the next one, and neither would the one after that. She closed the duty log. Outside the viewport, the halcyon corridor ran clean and empty in both directions. The stars scattered across it like they had been scattered for 1 billion years before any species with a name had come along to look at them and decide what they meant. It was the same corridor it had always been. It just belonged to someone now. Well, Yale said to no one in particular, to the empty command bay and the scope feeds and the quiet corridor and the stars that did not care. All right then,